Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. This was a terrific session. My name is Jane Ward. I've just completed a Master's of Public Health at George Washington, and I'm on the faculty of the Uniformed Services University, the military medical school here in town. From a public health perspective and a population health perspective, I haven't really heard us or heard presented to this group what would be the most healthy diet. Now, we've taken some of the recommendations that our major esteemed organizations have put out there, but I think that in your analyses, and I commend you all, there have been very interesting analyses, that you consider everything from no animal products at all to the typical American diet, which I consider to be the least healthy diet we have. We're an unusual species. There's not very many of other species that eat or drink somebody else's milk after being weaned. And there's a big push in public health circles now for U.S. to do more breastfeeding as long as possible, and then switch to more vegetables and fruits in our diets, basically throughout the rest of our lifestyle, or the lifespan. So I think it's very interesting that from each of your presentations, the most sustainable production and environmentally healthy impact is from plant production. And I think, Emily Cassidy, your presentation was very interesting, showing that we consume probably in the typical American diet 4 times the recommended amount of protein just from meat intake alone. I don't think 4 times the recommended level is healthy for us, and witness the amount of diabetes, health disease, cancers in our society. So if any of you would have a comment on where you think you should start in terms of your analyses and in terms of the dietary guidelines that you use, and whether you could expand your analyses to go from plant-based only to typical American, that would be very interesting, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that. I think the question, how much meat consumption is sustainable, is a really interesting and important question that we should think about answering. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of lazy about my eating habits, and trying to figure out what kinds of amino acids I need and what cereals to mix with which legumes is kind of an arduous thing to try to figure out. So I don't think going 100% vegan is, it might be an environmental optimal, but it's certainly not a nutritionally optimal way to go. So I think somewhere in between the American and no animal products is definitely the 2 extremes, but I don't know where that middle space is.
Yeah, I think from a life cycle perspective, we're close to having the methodological and sort of the data framework to be able to look at those differences in diet, and certainly a lot of the examples that I was referring to in the literature that I've been looking at do make those comparisons. Again, the challenge that I see in this is being able to better quantify that nutritional health or nutritional quality beyond the sort of stereotyping of diets. And coming back to Emily's point, what is the effect of a little bit of meat in our diet, both nutritionally and environmentally, and how do we begin to quantify those inclusions of reasonable amounts? From a nutritional side, I guess I'm thinking, we certainly can think about doing it on an environmental side.
I just add that I agree that incorporating a wide range of diets is desirable, and the only trade-off would be, are you limited in how many analyses you can do based on the methodology? And if that's the case, then you have to make real trade-offs. But if you don't, then cast the net wide.
Okay, next question, Eric.
Eric Decker, University of Massachusetts. I'm curious if, is this on?
I think so. Yeah.
I'm curious if anybody's doing these energy assessments on processed foods as well as just basic agriculture. I can think of a lot of examples where the processing of food takes in a huge amount of energy, and whether that's actually better done on an industrial scale versus a home scale. And I guess the best example I think of often is tomato sauce. You know, we literally remove billions of pounds of water from tomatoes to get those into consumable states. And so are people looking at this? Are they looking at, is it better to cook all products at home? Is it better to have some products produced en masse, an industrial scale?
I have seen some examples that look at that processing, you know, home versus commercially processed. The one that I'm thinking of looks at baking bread and comparing home baked with small, you know, like community artisan bakery with more commercial factory. And I'm trying to remember the details. What is sticking in mind is that the differences were far less significant than what you might think. I think part of the challenge in considering some of those processed foods is a lot of that a lot of that information is privately held, and it's difficult to access. You know, I mean.
Hi, Jennifer Wilkins from the Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell University. And I was wondering, a lot of the discussion has been around looking at different quantities of meat and different types of meat in the diet and animal products. I was wondering if anyone could comment on whether there have been really good analyses looking at different production systems of animal products. For example, a comparison between grass-based animal production and what the life cycle analysis or the environmental footprint would be of that, or the land requirements, versus the intensified production systems that are dominant.
Sure. I mean, for some reason, there seems to be a wealth of studies on milk production around the world, and a number of the ones that I'm familiar with do make those comparisons, considering organic versus conventional production. To be honest, I've not seen a great one that looks at grass-based versus conventional production. One thing to keep in mind, you know, a lot of what Dr. Midloner discussed, the production efficiencies that we see in comparison, in comparing those production systems, often translate very directly into environmental efficiencies when we're thinking about things like emission impacts per kilogram of milk produced, sort of thing.
I just add two quick comments. One is that it's not livestock related, but well, there may have been some livestock products. There was a meta-analysis that was released, I think, in the fall, comparing life cycle assessments of different production systems, all European examples. The other comment is that when you're looking at alternative production systems, from my experience trying to model land use, one of the challenges is trying to find data that well describes those systems, and that's the real stopping point, because then you get into primary data collection.
Okay, thank you.
This is just a quick point of clarification in response to the comment that we're eating 4 times the amount of meat that's recommended. I believe that meats, the protein group is the only group consumed in the proper amount, according to the federal data, and I was just looking at NHANES data yesterday. We're actually on the low end of the recommended protein consumption. I just didn't want to leave anybody with the impression that we're eating 4 times too much.
Thank you for another excellent and stimulating panel. So my question is collectively to the group, your comments and thoughts on the aspect of the amorphous area of functional foods and the more amorphous area of medicinal foods, and how this is driven by marketing and education of the consumer, with an example of the yogurt industry in upstate New York in demand versus sustainability and production.
I'll start. My work has tended to focus on diet and for a number of reasons. One, I'm not a nutritionist or a food scientist, so looking at functional foods would be more specific than I would necessarily go. So I focus on the entire diet. That said, I guess it would depend. I would see functional foods fitting in to the evaluation that's done at the end. Is there a critical function provided by a food that can't be provided elsewhere? And that's where I would see it weighing very heavily in a decision about, for example, in the context of sustainability guidelines. Is this something that can't be provided elsewhere? But in terms of defining what those foods are, I haven't done any of that work myself.
Specifically, like the marketing and education is driving the demand. Was what
Okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
So yogurt's really good for you, so now it's the #1 functional food in America. The demand in upstate New York can't meet supply. And a lot of these dairy farmers are supplying a complete yogurt line. So that's just an example. Trying to show, maybe it's another thing we need to look at in this equation.
Very possibly, especially if the yogurt's a nice example because there are many positive health benefits of eating yogurt. The question is, how do you help respond to growth in an industry like that in real time? And it's not easy.
I don't think I really have anything to add.
Other comments? Kate?
Kate Clancey, I'm a food systems consultant. This session was great. Thanks to all of you. I just wanted to make a correction for the rest of the meeting. And those of you who know my work will not be surprised that I want to point out that organic is not at all the same as grass-fed. And so the life cycle analysis would be completely different between grass-fed and organic. And also, I saw a slide where the speaker was talking about organic, but the slide said natural. Those aren't the same things either. So any kind of analysis would be very different between, so it would be really useful to make sure that everybody realizes there is a distinction among organic, natural, and grass-fed. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, another good session this morning. My name's Steve Schaefer. I'm with the USDA's Agricultural Research Service, and this is just a comment. I've had a sense that the term sustainability is not being used entirely consistently in our sessions here, which is not terribly surprising. It's pretty difficult to define. But in fact, the National Research Council put out a pretty hefty report just a couple of years ago on agricultural sustainability. And from that standpoint, their concept, I can't quote it exactly, but it basically boils down to the system, for an agricultural system to be sustainable, it has to produce what you want it to produce, it has to protect the natural resource base for future production, it has to provide some sort of economic incentive for anybody to produce it, and it has to have a support for the social, cultural matrix of communities and so forth, at least in this country. And that agricultural sustainability requires all four. And that what I'm hearing in a lot of the discussion is, well, this may be economically sustainable, but not environmentally sustainable, or it's production sustainable and not something else. It's either sustainable or it's not, and it's got to have all of those components to, adequately supported to be sustainable. So I just sort of make a comment on, as we go forward with these discussions, that we've really got to think of it comprehensively, and the NRC has done a pretty good job of characterizing that.
Thank you. Any other comments on that? I'd like to ask just a quick question, maybe not such a quick one. You know, the data sets that we use in all of these, how reliable are these data sets? You're all counting on this. I'm used to doing prospective control trials. And I know recently, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a paper that showed the wastage data that was at USDA's database on food wastage was really terribly inaccurate, and people admitted to that, finally. And you're all using data sets that are either satellite data, collected, they're not necessarily on-ground data. So just a comment about the reliability for those of us who are more laboratory science-based.
I'll start with an example of land use. I mean, I'll start with a general comment. In general, much of the data I work with on crop yields, for example, is collected year after year, and for locations where it's collected year after year, I think you can assure that it's relatively good and accurate data. Where it becomes more difficult is things on the margins. For example, if you're talking about specialty crops like fruits and vegetables in areas that are not major production centers, then your estimates become less frequent, you have less data to work with, you might be less sure of its accuracy, and you don't necessarily have a way of judging what its accuracy is. So it's an inherent peril. The other example I would give in terms of land use is that sometimes you need to differentiate between inaccuracy and actually differences in what's being measured. And a classic example, at least in the Northeast U.S., with land use is the area that's in particularly pasture production and hay crops. The picture you get from satellites versus the picture you get from the agricultural census, because they're very different. And there are reasonable explanations for that because they're not classifying exactly the same thing. So that's also another issue. In addition to the accuracy, there's reconciling things that are really different measurements.
Okay. Anybody else?
You're certainly right. I mean, we're working with large data sets that contain significant uncertainty. Estimating that uncertainty is usually an important part of conducting a life cycle assessment. Again, it's probably a piece of the interpretation of a lot of these numbers that we throw around that doesn't come along with the soundbite. And in life cycle assessment, we see uncertainty both in the data measurement, but also in impact assessment methods. And as we get to some of the more complicated impact assessment methods, human health and ecotoxicity, there's a lot of uncertainty wrapped up in that, to the point where if we're not talking about order of magnitude differences, you can't really call them significant.
Sounds like economics. It's a little bit like diapers. It depends. Another question, yes.
Well, you kind of prompted me to have another question about assumptions. I'm hearing an assumption that all arable land use is the same, and that land that's used for crops in one case can be used for a different crop depending on needs. We know that, I come from Ireland, and I know that that's not the case, that we have land there that's it's used in meat production, but it is totally unsuitable for crop production. And we can't grow maize in Ireland. Just as an example, we can't grow all crops. So how do you compensate for that, or how do you allow for the fact that all land is not equal in terms of its potential productivity?
Well, in the data that I showed for New York, I only presented the land requirements. The second part of that study was estimating how many people could be fed off of a given land base. And it's at that point that the differences in land capacity were accounted for. And the way it was accounted for, relatively simply, was that land was classified based on its potential. And in that case, we had three categories. There was land that was only suitable for pasturing, land that was suitable for perennial production or pasturing, and then land that could essentially be used for any purpose. And it's in the interpretation, I think, of what the land use data mean that you start to get to that issue of capacity. And it has a big impact on, for example, estimating how many people you could feed or how many complete diets you could produce from a given land base, because eventually you run out of one type of land. And then it becomes an issue of how do you make the best use of the limited resource. So it's an excellent point.
Okay. If not, let's thank the speakers again. See everyone at 2 o'clock.
Yes, thank you. We're going to reconvene in an hour, about 2 o'clock, and we welcome the presenters and moderators and forum roundtable members to join us in the members' room, and members from the public if you want to join. There's a cafeteria in the lower level, and we can help you, direct you there. And thank you, webcast listeners. We'll be reconvening in an hour.